Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Dr. Mara Ellison. Today, we're returning to a case that keeps resurfacing in conversations about coercive control, medical abuse, and the limits of our legal system, the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case. With me is Professor Daniel Ruiz, former public defender and criminal law scholar. Daniel, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Mara. It's good to be here. This case, it's complicated on so many levels.
Complicated, yes, and morally messy. That's exactly why we're calling this episode Still Unanswered. We're not here to sensationalize. We're here to sit with the questions that remain after the headlines fade. So let's start, Daniel. Briefly, the moment that shocked everyone, the "she can walk" moment. Lay it out for listeners, please.
Right. So in June 2015, Claudine Dee Dee Blanchard is found murdered in her Springfield, Missouri home. Police, tracing a suspicious Facebook post, track a lead to Wisconsin. When they get to the house, they find Gypsy Rose Blanchard walking out of a bedroom. The town had believed she was wheelchair-bound, chronically ill, cognitively impaired. That image collapsed in an instant. People were stunned.
Stunned and, in many cases, betrayed. But the shock turned quickly to a deeper puzzle. Why had nobody, doctors, social workers, charities, neighbors, seen the pattern? How had Dee Dee constructed a life around Gypsy's illness for so long? Let's take a step back and map the timeline, because context matters here.
Good idea. Quick spine of the timeline. Gypsy was born in 1991 in Louisiana. Dee Dee began presenting her as seriously ill almost from childhood. A raft of conditions, epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, leukemia were among the claims. They moved after Hurricane Katrina and landed in Springfield, Missouri, where the narrative, the miracle child story, really took hold. Charities got involved. Habitat for Humanity built a wheelchair-accessible home. Fast forward to 2011 and later, Gypsy has secret online accounts, meets Nicholas Gojon. By 2015, Gojon travels to Springfield and Dee Dee is stabbed to death. Gypsy pleads guilty to second-degree murder in 2016. Nick is convicted at trial and gets life without parole in 2019.
Yes. And those are the contours listeners may remember. But we can't move past the label, FDIA, formerly Munchausen syndrome by Proxy. Daniel, can you help explain FDIA in a way that's clinically accurate but also understandable?
Sure. FDIA, factitious disorder imposed on another, describes a caregiver who fabricates, exaggerates, or even induces physical or psychological problems in a dependent, often a child. The motivation is psychological: attention, sympathy, identity as a devoted caregiver. It sits in the DSM-5. Importantly, the caregiver's reward is primarily emotional, though material benefits, charity, financial assistance, community praise often follow. Dee Dee's pattern fits many FDIA markers: frequent doctor visits, inconsistent or unverifiable symptoms, invasive procedures with scant objective findings, and a relentless public performance of caregiving.
Right. And the term matter-of-factly describes behavior but doesn't fully capture the devastation for the child who grows up internalizing a sick identity. Okay, pause. Let's talk about what life looked like in Springfield. Listeners, picture a small city where neighbors and charity organizations saw a mother caring for a disabled child. They donated vacations, medical supplies, even a home. That public goodwill played a role in insulating the deception.
Exactly. It's a kind of moral blind spot. When someone appears saintly and needy in ways we can easily help, wheelchair ramp, oxygen tanks in the yard, we feel happy to assist. No one wants to interrogate a grieving, devoted mother. And when doctors in different clinics get fragments of a history, there's no centralized system to flag patterns of over-medicalization. Records are scattered across states, so no one put the pieces together.
That fragmentation is critical. Clinically, FDIA cases often get uncovered when the child is separated from the caregiver and improves, but here, that separation never happened for years. Gypsy later said she understood she could walk by her late teens, that she saw documents with her correct birth date, and that she'd been told she was fragile her whole life. Imagine being conditioned to fear your own body and the idea that seeking help will only send you into an institution. That's coercion, plain and simple.
Yes, coercion, psychological control, is central to understanding Gypsy's later actions. But here's the legal tension. Coercion in criminal law often targets immediate threats, a gun to the head, a clear present danger. Psychological abuse that accumulates over decades doesn't fit neatly into most duress or self-defense doctrines. So when Gypsy is implicated in her mother's murder, the law struggles to incorporate a lifetime of control into culpability assessments.
And that's one of our still unanswered questions. What counts as self-defense when the abuse is years of medical manipulation rather than a single violent incident? Can we equate prolonged deprivation of agency to immediate lethal threat? Daniel, how has the justice system historically treated coercion that's not immediate?
It varies. Traditionally, duress or coercion defenses require an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, no safe avenue of escape, and a proportionality between the threat and the defendant's response. Psychological control and ongoing abuse sometimes get considered under battered person syndrome in domestic violence contexts, where courts have accepted psychological conditioning as relevant to perception of imminent danger. But FDI cases complicate this. Judges and juries have limited instruction sets for lifetime coercion that culminates in violence. In Gypsy's case, she accepted a plea to second-degree murder, arguably because the plea reduced peril of a death penalty exposure and a risky trial. The plea doesn't resolve the normative question. Should prolonged coercive control weigh more heavily in culpability calculus?
And there's the additional moral mess. Gypsy supplied duct tape, gloves, and a knife, then says she covered her ears while Nick stabbed Dee Dee. Some media reports suggested she orchestrated the murder. Others highlighted that she was trapped, frightened. So, listeners, where do we place responsibility? Gypsy as victim-perpetrator or something else? Daniel?
We have to avoid simple binaries. Gypsy's decades of abuse produced severe limitations in her capacity to make autonomous, future-oriented decisions. That's relevant. But she also took concrete steps that facilitated the killing. The legal system, for pragmatic reasons, treated them differently. Gypsy took a plea, got 10 years. Nick went to trial and got life. The disparity raises fairness questions. Was Nick harsher because he was the instrument of lethal force, or because he lacked mitigating narratives of victimization? Both played a role.
I want to interrupt you for 1 second, Daniel. Listeners, we shouldn't let that legal outcome alone determine our moral sense. The law follows rules, some of which are blunt instruments for complex human lives. In therapy and clinical contexts, we talk about responsibility on a spectrum. In other words, you can be profoundly victimized and still be culpable for certain acts. The challenge is calibrating accountability with understanding.
Agreed, and part of why Nick's sentence was so severe, jurors heard that he traveled across state lines, accepted the knife, stabbed Dee Dee multiple times, and did not immediately seek help or turn himself in. The prosecution emphasized premeditation and intent, Defense argued autism spectrum disorder, suggestibility, and that he was deeply influenced by Gypsy. Ultimately, jury verdicts tend to privilege observable, concrete acts over nuanced histories of influence. That's part of the problem.
Right. And there's more. After the murder, they shopped, they stayed in motels, and they were captured in surveillance footage. Those images made it easier for the public to conclude they weren't in immediate peril. But context matters. People behave in complex ways even after trauma. Some survivors go to great lengths to construct normalcy. It doesn't undo the prior suffering.
Mara, you're getting at something legal doctrine struggles to quantify. Choices made under the long shadow of trauma can look like dispassionate behavior, but they may be survival strategies or dissociative responses.
Exactly. Let's pivot for a few minutes to Dee Dee. This is difficult because she's often portrayed as a one-dimensional monster. I want to complicate that. The source material shows a woman who may have had FDI behaviors herself, but who also had a traumatic and destabilizing past, allegations of petty crime, instability. How do we balance acknowledging her likely pathology with the very real harm she caused?
It's crucial to hold both truths. Dee Dee likely inflicted extraordinary harm on Gypsy, physical, emotional, developmental. And she may herself have been mentally ill. Understanding that complexity doesn't excuse murder. It explains the ecosystem of abuse. From a legal and policy perspective, had Dee Dee been identified earlier as someone with a pattern of imposing illness on others, different interventions might have followed: psychiatric commitment, loss of custody, or rigorous oversight. Unfortunately, none of that happened.
And that leads us to one of the systemic failures, the role of medicine and charity. How did so many doctors miss patterns? How did nonprofit organizations and neighbors contribute to an environment where Dee Dee's performance went unquestioned? Let's unpack that.
Okay, first, medical fragmentation. Gypsy had records across states and clinics. There wasn't a unified record that screamed red flag. Second, clinicians are trained to treat what's reported unless objective signs contradict it. FDIA is rare and requires suspicion that many providers may not cultivate. Third, community confirmation bias. When donations and praise pile up, it creates reputational insulation. People who might raise concerns are disinclined to doubt a narrative that benefits others.
All true. I'll add, mandatory reporters, teachers, social workers, had limited access to Gypsy because she was effectively isolated. So the usual safety nets weren't present. And charities sometimes don't do rigorous follow-ups. They want to help quickly. That urgency can be weaponized by a manipulative caregiver.
Mara, your point about mandatory reporters is crucial. If a child isn't in regular school, there's a gap in oversight. Perhaps we need better protocols for families receiving extensive medical or disability benefits, some form of periodic independent assessment. But then we bump into civil liberties concerns. Families could be wrongly targeted, like in the Maya Kowalski case referenced in our notes, where suspicion of medical kidnapping led to its own cascade of trauma and eventually litigation. So the policy solutions are not straightforward.
Yeah, policy never sits in a vacuum. We have to balance protection against misdiagnosis and overreach. I want to pause here and touch on another hard question, the media's role. How did documentaries, dramatizations, podcasts shape public perception of Gypsy and Dee Dee? We both know HBO's Mommy, Dead and Dearest and Hulu's The Act reached millions and built archetypes: monster mom, tragic daughter.
Media simplifies stories to fit narrative arcs. Dee Dee becomes the villain. Gypsy becomes the tragic anti-hero. Those simplifications sell, but they also shape public morality. People start petitioning for leniency, or conversely, clamor for harsher punishment, based on narratives that may omit nuance. And once the story is commodified, interviews, book deals, social media personas, there's an ethical line about profiting from trauma that we need to interrogate.
Listeners, here's where I get uneasy. Gypsy's release in 2023 and subsequent life, marriages, motherhood, brand deals, interviews, has been framed both as a healing arc and as commercialization. Is it wrong for survivors to reclaim their stories and, yes, earn income from them? Or does that risk rewarding violent behavior? Daniel?
There's no simple answer. From a restorative standpoint, someone who spent years under extreme abuse may need resources to rebuild a life. Monetary resources can mean therapy, stable housing, a chance at parenting without fear. From a social ethics standpoint, the optics are thorny. A person convicted of conspiring and murder becomes a paid media figure, while the actual triggerman remains incarcerated for life. The system's choices, plea bargains, sentencing disparities, create these asymmetries, and the media then amplifies them.
And that amplification sometimes distracts from policy conversations. Instead of asking how to better detect FDIA or how to expand coercive control frameworks legally, the public gets obsessed with clickbait. We owe it to victims, both Gypsy and others injured by similar caregiving abuse, to focus on prevention and on care, not just on ratings.
Mara, can I push back gently? Some people will always want the dramatic arc. The question, legally, is whether our criminal laws are adaptable. Do we need new statutory frameworks for chronic coercive control that acknowledge psychological captivity as distinct from instantaneous duress? Countries like the UK have started to codify coercive control in domestic contexts. Maybe the US should consider similar constructs that could affect culpability or sentencing. Countries like Gypsy and others injured by similar caregiving abuse to focus on prevention and on care, not just on ratings.
I'm glad you said that, Daniel. I do think legislatures should take coercive control seriously, but we must be careful. Criminalizing broad categories risks vagueness and misuse. We'd need tightly defined elements, clear patterns of isolation, manipulation of medical interventions, demonstrable restriction of autonomy, and robust evidentiary standards. Otherwise, we risk substituting one kind of injustice for another.
True. Any legal reform would need to be paired with medical and social services reforms. For example, better FDIA training for clinicians, centralized reporting mechanisms across hospitals, and targeted oversight for extreme cases where a caregiver presents a child as critically ill, but objective findings don't match. And, importantly, pathways to protect whistleblowers and relatives. Think of Rod, Gypsy's father, who tried to raise concerns but was kept at a distance.
Yes, Rod's experience stands out. He paid child support, wanted to help, but was sidelined. Family members often smell something wrong first, but they lack access to records and can be easily dismissed by a persuasive caregiver. Maybe there's a role for legal reforms allowing limited access to records for concerned family members under a defined standard of suspicion.
Potentially. But again, that runs into privacy law and HIPAA constraints. Perhaps a middle path. Mandated review when a child receives sustained charity or public assistance based on claims of severe disability. An administrative review could flag anomalous cases for further assessment without immediate public exposure.
That's practical. Okay, let's move back to the human side for a few minutes. Daniel, you represented many folks as a public defender. How would you advise a jury or a judge to think about Gypsy's moral responsibility now that she's out and parenting? Does her parole and reintegration change how we should judge her?
Empathy first, then accountability. She served a sentence consistent with her plea. Many survivors benefit from structured reintegration, therapy, supervision, and support that reduces recidivism and aids recovery. From a legal perspective, if someone serves a sentence and is paroled lawfully, the punitive purpose has been partially fulfilled. But society's moral judgment is separate. That's where debate continues. Some will never accept that a convicted conspirator can be a functioning parent. Others will say lifelong punishment without rehabilitation is cruel and counterproductive.
And clinically, parenting can be incredibly healing if there's good therapy and monitoring to prevent repetition. Gypsy has publicly said she wants to be transparent with her child to avoid patterns of secrecy and control. That's promising, but it needs infrastructure, mental health care, parenting support, and a community that holds her accountable without re-traumatizing her.
On the subject of accountability, what about Nick? He's serving life without parole. Does his conviction still stand up to scrutiny given new understandings of autism and coercion?
From a clinical angle, autism spectrum disorder varies. Some individuals are more suggestible and vulnerable to manipulation. Others are not. Diagnosis alone doesn't explain violent acts, but it should factor into sentencing and perhaps in considerations for rehabilitation. I ask, do we have effective correctional interventions for people like Nick? And does society allow the possibility of rehabilitation for individuals with significant cognitive or adaptive deficits?
Those are crucial questions. The criminal system tends to be backward-looking, focusing on blame and retribution. For someone like Nick, a more nuanced approach would evaluate his cognitive profile, capacity for understanding right and wrong, and amenability to treatment. Even if he committed a horrific act, the absolute denial of any future release, life without parole, is an intentionally final sentence. Some argue that justice demands permanent removal. Others argue there's always a possibility for growth and change, particularly when developmental disorders are involved.
This is one of those cases where our values collide. Incapacitation, retribution, rehabilitation, and mercy. No single answer will satisfy everyone. That's why we called this episode Still Unanswered. Let's take a moment to address something listeners often ask. Did Gypsy have viable, non-violent escape options? Could she have run to a neighbor, contacted her biological father, or reached out to authorities? She was isolated, but not absolutely immobile. Thoughts?
Right. Some argue she could have acted differently. The 2011 convention incident, for example, showed she tried to leave but was forcibly returned and then had her electronics destroyed. Over time, that teaches a person that attempts to escape will be punished. In legal terms, someone who has been conditioned to expect punishment for seeking help may perceive all escape attempts as futile or dangerous. So while hypothetically there were options, the realistic appraisal of Gypsy's perceived costs and risks matters. The law sometimes measures against an objective standard. Would a reasonable person have fled? But what is reasonable after decades of conditioning?
That's an excellent point. Subjective perception shaped by trauma is crucial. We need jurors and judges who can grapple with those psychological realities rather than default to cold rationality. It's also why clinicians and defense teams must present that history coherently at trial. Gypsy opted for a plea, and that means many of her story's nuances never got fully tested in open court. We'll never know how a jury might have weighed it.
Which brings us to the plea bargain system. It's practical. It reduces uncertainty and spares courts. But it can also obscure systemic issues. When defendants plead to avoid the death penalty or a harsher sentence, the public record can become thinner, and the nuanced narratives of coercion and abuse may remain unexplored. When defendants plead to avoid the death penalty or a harsher sentence, the public record can become thinner, and the nuanced narratives of coercion and abuse may remain unexplored.
Yes, and then the media fills those gaps with speculation. Okay, Daniel, listeners, we're about halfway through. Let's do a segment where we pull on big policy threads. First, better FDIA recognition in medicine. Second, a legal concept for chronic coercion. Third, safeguards to prevent frantic charitable oversights. Which of these is most practicable?
All three are necessary. If I had to prioritize for immediate impact, FDIA recognition and inter-hospital data sharing. A clinician who sees a pattern across multiple facilities can alert Child Protective Services with stronger evidence. Then, secondly, legal reform. Create an evidentiary framework for considering long-term coercion as a mitigating factor. Third, build better protocols for charities and nonprofits to verify claims before large gifts, not to prevent giving, but to require periodic checks for extreme cases.
I agree. One practical tool is training modules for pediatricians and emergency physicians that flag frequent, inconsistent histories and encourage multidisciplinary case reviews. Another is anonymized, centralized repeat visit flags across electronic health records. But of course, this requires funding and political will.
And there's an education piece for the public. Donors and communities should be informed. Generosity shouldn't be blind to patterns that might indicate manipulation. That's a tough message, but it's part of prevention.
Listeners, we're nearing the close, and I want to pull the conversation back to the moral center. We've covered facts, the timeline, FDIA, legal outcomes, media effects, and policy. But let's end with what I think matters most: empathy, accountability, and prevention. Daniel, if you had to leave our listeners with 3 clear, actionable takeaways, what would they be?
1. Legal systems should develop clearer ways to account for chronic psychological coercion in culpability and sentencing without opening avenues for misuse. 2. Medical systems need better protocols to identify and respond to FDIA, centralized records, multidisciplinary reviews, and clinician training. 3. As a public, we must demand that media and content creators resist simplistic narratives and support policy-driven conversations rather than only emotional spectacle.
I'll add, from a clinical angle, 1. Survivors need access to long-term mental health care tailored to trauma from medical abuse. 2. Families should be given pathways to raise concerns safely, with legal protections when they do. 3. If you suspect abuse, listen, document, and report to trained professionals rather than acting alone. And finally, we should resist easy moral narratives.
Mara, can I be blunt for a second? People will always want a villain and a hero. This case refuses that comfort, and that's why it's useful. It forces us to reckon with systems that fail, with the limits of law, and with the messy entanglement of victimhood and culpability. If we leave this conversation only having assigned blame, we've missed the point.
I couldn't agree more. Listeners, before we sign off, a quick note on resources. If today's discussion brought up distressing feelings, whether you have a trauma history or are processing the material, please contact local mental health services or crisis lines. If you suspect medical abuse in a child, contact Child Protective Services and your county health department. If you're a clinician, look up FDIA resources and multidisciplinary teams in pediatrics. We'll post companion links and resources on our episode page.
Also, for legal-minded listeners, if you're interested in the interplay between coercion and criminal culpability, look into scholarly work on battered person syndrome, coercive control statutes in other nations, and recent articles on FDIA detection protocols. There's a body of reform literature worth reading.
Thank you, Daniel. Final words?
Thanks, Mara. Just keep asking the hard questions. Still unanswered should push us beyond headlines into policy and practice. This case is a prompt, not a verdict.
Amen to that. Thank you to our listeners for joining us in a careful, sometimes hard conversation. If this episode resonated, please consider supporting evidence-based reporting and organizations working to prevent child abuse. We'll be back next week with another case that refuses a tidy ending. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. This is Dr. Mara Ellison, signing off.